The morning Lydia Hadley finally worked up the nerve to press her palm flat against the cool glass of her window and stare directly at the rider passing below. She had already been watching him for 43 days straight, and she had counted every single one of them. It had started in late October of 1874, when the town of Dustfield, Texas, was pulling itself through the tail end of a dry autumn, and the streets were soft with pale dust that rose in little clouds whenever anything moved through them. Lydia had come to Dustfield 6 months before that, following the death of her father, Edwin Hadley, who had left her a modest dry goods store on the main street and a two-room living space above it, with a single window that faced east toward the open land where the scrub brush grew in scattered patches, and the sky turned colors at dawn that made her chest hurt with something she could not name. She was 26 years old, unmarried and entirely alone in a town where she knew almost no one well enough to sit beside them at the Sunday service without feeling like an afterthought. She had grown up in San Antonio, where the streets were louder and the neighbors were closer together, and Dustfield felt to her like a town that had simply forgotten to finish itself. There were gaps between buildings where structures had been planned and never built, and the people who lived there had a way of looking at strangers as though they were assessing how long they intended to stay before they made any investment in knowing them. Lydia had poured herself into the store. She reorganized every shelf, restocked what her father had let run low, learned the names of her regular customers and what they needed before they asked. She kept the books herself carefully in a ledger with a green cloth cover that she had brought from San Antonio. She lit the lamp in the store window at precisely 7 in the morning and locked the door each evening at 6. She was methodical and she was capable, and she was, underneath all of that efficiency, profoundly lonely in a way she had not yet admitted to herself. The rider appeared on the morning of October 3rd. She had been at the window at dawn because she could not sleep, watching the light come across the flat land east of town, when she heard the steady beat of hooves on the hard-packed road below. A man on a dark bay horse, moving at an easy walk, not rushing, not dawdling, simply passing through at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be but was not in a hurry about it. He wore a dark hat pulled low and a canvas work coat that had seen considerable weather, and he sat his horse the way that only a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle could sit, with a kind of unconscious ease that made it look like the horse was simply an extension of him. He did not look up. He passed below her window and continued down the road and turned north at the end of the street, and that was that, except the next morning he came again, and the morning after that. She found herself waking earlier without meaning to, drawn to the window before she could think about why. There was something about the regularity of him, the absolute reliability of his appearance in that pale early light, that had begun to feel like the most certain thing in her life. And that, she understood on some level, said a great deal about the state of her life. By the second week she had observed the following. He always came from the south end of town, which meant he was riding from somewhere south of Dustfield. He always turned north at the end of the street. He never stopped. He never looked up at her window, not once, despite the fact that she had begun standing closer to the glass as the days progressed, drawn forward by a curiosity she could not seem to manage. The horse was well kept, a good animal, not a working cow horse necessarily, but not a fancy animal either, something in between. The man himself was tall in the saddle, broad in the shoulder, and his hands on the reins were easy. She thought about him more than she had any right to. She learned his approximate schedule. He passed at approximately 6:30 in the morning, give or take 10 minutes depending on the day. She began setting her own morning around this marker without acknowledging to herself that she was doing so. She would have her coffee made and be at the window when the light was still thin and the street below was mostly empty, and she would watch him pass, and then she would go down and open the store, and her day would begin. In November the weather turned sharper and she watched him pass in a heavier coat, frost still on the ground some mornings, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. She had by then taken to noting small details the way a person notes details about something they are trying to understand. The way he adjusted his hat once, just a slight push with 2 fingers when the wind came from the north. The way the horse tossed its head occasionally and he let it, patient with the animal's small opinions. She had asked around, carefully, without being obvious about it. Mrs. Crane at the feed store knew most of the working men in the area, and Lydia had managed to introduce the subject sideways, asking about a delivery of rope and sliding into a question about whether there were many ranch hands in the area who rode through town in the early mornings. Mrs. Crane had told her about the Tanner spread, which was 5 miles south, and the Beaumont operation, which was another 3 beyond that. She had mentioned several names, none of which stuck to Lydia in any meaningful way. It was not until early December, when the sky was iron-colored and the air had the bite of coming winter in it, that she finally learned his name. He had stopped. She had nearly missed it because she was closer to the back of the room than she usually stood, reaching for her shawl from the hook near the door to the stairs, and she heard the horse stop below, and then heard nothing for a long moment and leaned back toward the window and looked down, and he was simply there, the horse standing still in the street, and the man sitting very still in the saddle, looking at something across the way. There was a loose board on the front of the hardware store that had come free and was making a sharp cracking noise in the wind, and he was watching it with the particular attention of a man who is evaluating whether something needs fixing. Then old Pete Garrity came out of the hardware store with a hammer and a nail, apparently having heard it himself, and the man on the horse said something Lydia could not hear, and Pete looked up and said, "Morning, Abbott." And the man on the horse said something else, and Pete laughed and went back to his board, and the man on the horse turned north and was gone. Abbott. She held the name in her mind for the rest of the day. That evening she asked Pete Garrity, who came into her store for flour and lamp oil, about the man. She asked it lightly, as though it had just come to mind, as though she had barely registered the exchange that morning. Pete told her that his name was Clarence Abbott, that he had been working at the Tanner spread for going on 2 years, that he had come from somewhere north, Kansas maybe, or Missouri, Pete was not sure, that he was a good enough fellow, quiet, did his work, kept to himself, that he had a reputation for being fair with horses and for being honest about weather, which in Pete's estimation were the 2 most important things you could say about a man in that country. Clarence Abbott. She was 26, and she was standing in a dry goods store in Dustfield, Texas, in December of 1874, and she was holding the name of a man she had never spoken to as though it were something fragile. She did not allow herself to examine this too closely. The thing about Dustfield was that it was small enough that she should have encountered him by now if he spent any time in town, but he apparently did not. He passed through on his way somewhere north of town and returned by some other route, or perhaps he returned in the evening when she was occupied, or perhaps he turned around north of town and came back through the night. She did not know. She only knew the morning passage, regular as the sunrise itself. Christmas came and went. She decorated the store window with a length of red ribbon she had ordered from the supply catalog, and she went to the Christmas service at the small white church and sang the hymns and smiled at the people who smiled at her. And she went back upstairs alone and ate a dinner she had cooked for herself, and thought about San Antonio and her father and the years that had passed and the years that were still ahead of her. All of them uncertain and empty in a way that the store and its ledger and its regular customers could not entirely fill. On Christmas morning, the rider passed at exactly 6:30, same as always. She stood at the window in her nightgown with her coffee, and she watched him go, and she thought, impractically and with a fullness in her chest that she was not prepared for, that there was something almost comforting about the constancy of him. The world changed. People left. Her father had died. San Antonio was behind her. But every morning, reliable as the turning of the earth, Clarence Abbott passed below her window on his dark bay horse and rode north. January of 1875 arrived cold and clear, the kind of cold that made the air feel brittle, and Lydia had been running the store long enough by then that she had found her footing with it. She had made a few connections in town that had grown into something close to friendship. There was Margaret Tellers, who ran the boarding house on the South End, and who had a sharp tongue and a warm heart, and who came by every Thursday to look at the fabrics Lydia kept in bolts along the east wall. And there was Dr. Emmett Hale, who was 60 years old and had lived in Dustfield since it was nothing but a trading post, and who occasionally sat with Lydia on her porch steps in the evenings and told her stories about the town's history that she suspected were 30% embellished but were entirely entertaining. Through Margaret, she eventually learned more about the Tanner spread. It was a cattle operation, running maybe 400 head. Old Mr. Tanner had passed away the previous spring, and his son, Will Tanner, was running it now, 28 years old and in over his head by most accounts, relying heavily on his two best ranch hands to keep the operation functional. One of those hands was a man named Dex Purcell, who was large and loud and occasionally came into town on Saturday nights and caused manageable amounts of trouble at the saloon. The other was Clarence Abbott, who apparently never came into town at all if he could avoid it, who handled the horse management and a fair portion of the organizing work that Will Tanner was too scattered to do himself. "He is a serious man," Margaret told her one Thursday afternoon, her fingers moving through a bolt of blue calico with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to evaluate value at a glance. "Comes in here once a month maybe for supplies, doesn't talk much, has good manners. Not the kind of man who fills a room up with noise, you understand. The other kind." "The other kind," Lydia repeated, pretending to be occupied with her ledger. "The kind that makes you want to know what he is thinking," Margaret said, without looking up from the fabric, and smiled to herself. Lydia said nothing. In February, the weather gave them a brief warm spell, 4 or 5 days of almost spring-like air that felt like a promise the season had no intention of keeping, and on the second day of this warmth Lydia did something she had not planned to do. She opened the window. She had not opened it all winter, it being too cold, but on this mild morning she lifted the sash and let the early air in, and she stood there with her coffee and the soft sound of the waking town below her, and she heard the horse coming down the road from the south at its familiar pace, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was going to say something. She had not prepared anything. She had no particular opening in mind. She simply found herself leaning forward when the horse reached the point below her window, and she said, "Good morning." The horse kept moving. The man did not look up. He was perhaps 3 feet past the window before the greeting could have reached him, and she was not sure she had said it loudly enough. And the moment passed, and he turned north at the end of the street, and she stood with her coffee and felt ridiculous and also, confusingly, more alive than she had felt in months. She tried again the next morning, louder this time. "Good morning." The horse stopped. It stopped so quickly and so completely that she understood the man had reined it in, not that it had spooked or stumbled. There was a long moment in which nothing moved at all, the street empty except for the horse and its rider, and then, slowly, the man looked up. She had not been prepared for his face. She did not know what she had expected, in 40-some-odd mornings of watching the top of his hat go by. But she had not expected the directness of his gaze when it finally arrived, or the steadiness of it, or the particular quality of his features, which were not handsome in any decorative way, but were instead the kind of face that you trusted without deciding to. He was perhaps 30 or close enough to 30 that the difference was irrelevant. He had a jaw that was clean-shaven but showed the shadow of a morning not yet addressed, and eyes that were pale in the early light, some color she could not quite name from this distance. He looked at her for a moment. "Morning," he said. His voice was low, not rough, simply contained, the voice of a man who did not waste words. Then he turned north and was gone. She stood at the open window in the February air, and she thought, with a feeling of something opening in her chest like a door she had forgotten was there, that she had made a terrible mistake, and also that she intended to do it again tomorrow. She did it again tomorrow, and the day after. It became, over the next 2 weeks, a new ritual added to the existing one. She would be at the window, the sash open regardless of the temperature now, and he would pass and she would say good morning and he would say good morning back, and his horse would not quite stop anymore, but it would slow, just perceptibly, as though acknowledging the exchange. Margaret noticed something had changed about her. "You seem lighter," Margaret said on one of their Thursday afternoons. "What happened?" "Nothing happened," Lydia said. "Something happened," Margaret said, in the tone of a woman who had seen a great many things happen to people and knew the signs. She looked at Lydia steadily, and Lydia held her ground for about 4 seconds before she said, "I have been saying good morning to someone," and felt her face go warm. Margaret pressed her for details with the cheerful relentlessness of someone who collected information about other people's emotional lives as a hobby, and Lydia gave her very little, but enough that Margaret went home that Thursday knowing approximately what was happening and extremely interested in its progression. The first real conversation happened in March. She had been watching, over the 2 weeks prior, as the sky to the west began building those enormous dark towers of cloud that preceded the spring storms, and she had known from her father's stories, and from her own reading that West Texas springs could turn violent with very little warning. She had been preparing the store for it, checking the shutters on the store windows, ordering extra lamp oil, making sure her roof was sound. On the morning of March 12th, she was at her window with the dawn, and the air had that particular electric quality to it, the kind that made the hair on your arms rise slightly, and the sky was already streaked with high thin cloud from the southwest, and she knew that something was coming. When Clarence Abbott appeared at the south end of the street on his dark bay horse, she leaned out further than she usually did, and she said, "There is a storm coming." He stopped the horse. He looked up at her. He looked at the sky, he looked up at her again. "Yes," he said, "coming fast, before noon, I think." "Before noon," she repeated. She found that she wanted to keep him there. She wanted to keep him talking. "Are you far from the ranch?" "Far enough," he said. There was a brief pause in which he seemed to be considering something. "You have the shutters on the east side of this building loose," he said. "The lower right one, saw it the other day." She blinked. He had been looking at the building, he had noticed things. She felt something warm move through her chest. "I noticed that," she said. "I have not had anyone to look at it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I could come back through this afternoon, if you want it fixed before the storm hits." She said yes before she had finished thinking about whether she should. He came back at 2 in the afternoon with a tool belt and a box of appropriate hardware, and he fixed the shutter in the methodical, efficient way she was beginning to understand was simply how he did things. She came outside to watch, telling herself she was checking the work, knowing she was doing no such thing. Up close he was taller than she had estimated from above, and quieter somehow, the way a room is quieter than an empty hallway. He worked without talking much, but when she asked him questions he answered them, fully and without impatience. She learned that he was 31, that he had grown up in Missouri, not Kansas as Pete Garrity had guessed. That he had come south following work, following horses specifically, because he had a gift with them that people would pay for. That he had been at the Tanner spread for 2 years and was thinking about another year beyond that. He did not say what came after, and she did not ask. She learned that his horse's name was Cedar. She thought that was a very good name for that horse. He finished the shutter with 15 minutes to spare before the first fat drops of rain began to fall, and he put his tools away with the same calm economy with which he had done everything else, and he looked up at the sky with the expression of someone reading familiar text, and he said he ought to get back to the ranch. "Thank you," she said. And then she said, because something in her refused to let the moment simply close, "I am Lydia Hadley. I run the dry goods store." He looked at her with that direct, steady look. "I know," he said. "Clarence Abbott," he paused. "I know you know that too." She went very still. He held her gaze for 1 second, and she thought she saw something in his eyes that she could not name, something careful and quiet and very aware. "Goodbye, Miss Hadley," he said. He touched the brim of his hat and he walked Cedar to the hitching post where he had tied him, and he swung up into the saddle with that effortless economy of movement, and he rode south as the storm began to open above them. She stood in the first real rain of spring, and she thought she was in considerable trouble. The trouble, as it turned out, was mutual, though she would not know that for some time. After that, the morning greetings had a different quality to them. He slowed more obviously now, and the exchanges stretched a little longer, a sentence or two added onto the good morning. He asked once whether she had taken on any new inventory, and she told him she had gotten a shipment of tools in from the catalog, and he said he would stop by the store sometime when he was in town for supplies. She said that would be fine. He came in on a Saturday afternoon in late March, and she was behind the counter entering figures into her ledger when the bell over the door sounded, and she looked up, and there he was, hat in hand, because he had apparently been raised with manners, looking at the store the way he looked at things, with that careful, taking-it-all-in attention. She showed him the new tools. She showed him the rope she had gotten in, which was a better quality than the previous supply, and he tested it between his hands and agreed. He bought several items, not extravagantly but thoughtfully, as though he had come with a real list and was checking items off. She wrapped his purchases in brown paper, and he paid exactly and said thank you, and then he stood for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, hat still in hand, and she waited. "I was wondering," he said, and then stopped, which was unusual because he was generally not a man who started sentences he did not finish. He looked at the counter between them. Then he looked at her. "If you were in the habit of walking on Sunday afternoons." She kept her expression even with considerable effort. "I have been known to," she said. "There is a good path along the creek north of town," he said, "if you did not know it." "I did not know it," she said. There was a pause. "Sunday," he said. 2 o'clock. "Sunday," she agreed. 2 o'clock. He nodded. He put his hat on. He left. She stared at the door for a long moment, and then she pressed both hands flat on the counter and breathed. The Sunday walk along the creek was, in its way, a revelation. She had expected the same quality of conversation they had managed through a window and over a store counter, careful and contained, but what she had not anticipated was how the open space worked on him. Away from the town and its people, with the early April sun cutting through the cottonwoods along the creek bank and the water moving quietly over its stones, Clarence Abbott expanded slightly, like a plant that has been given the right conditions. He was not transformed into a talkative man. He was simply a man who talked with her, actually talked, not just replied. He told her about the horses at the Tanner spread, 4 of which were his particular responsibility, and his voice when he talked about them had a quality she had heard from people who loved their work. He told her about a mare who was coming along beautifully after a difficult spring, and a gelding who had a habit of unlocking gates that Clarence found more admirable than frustrating. She found herself laughing at this, and he looked at her when she laughed with an expression of surprised pleasure, as though he had not been certain the story would land and was pleased that it had. She told him about San Antonio, about her father, who had been a merchant his whole life, and who had taught her the dry goods trade the way other fathers taught their daughters to embroider, as a serious skill, a livelihood. She told him about coming to Dustfield after Edwin Hadley died, about the strangeness of inheriting a store in a town she barely knew, about the months of learning to see it as her own. He listened in the way he did everything with full attention, and he asked questions that showed he had heard her, not general polite questions but specific ones, following the thread of what she had said. They walked for an hour and a half. When they returned to the south end of town where the path met the road, he walked her back to the store, and at the door he said he had enjoyed the walk, and she said she had as well, and he said good afternoon, touching his hat brim, and she went inside, and Margaret, who happened to be passing on the opposite side of the street at precisely that moment, raised her eyebrows with theatrical significance, and Lydia pretended not to see her. The weeks that followed had a warmth to them that had nothing to do with the improving weather, though the weather was also improving, April rolling into a bright and generous May that turned the scrubland around Dustfield unexpectedly green. They walked every Sunday. He came into the store 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with a genuine errand and sometimes, she gradually came to understand, without one. He would browse the shelves with a purposeful air and buy something small, a tin of something, a length of wire, an item that a working ranch hand might reasonably need, but the efficiency with which he usually approached tasks was notably absent on these occasions. He was in no hurry to leave. She was always happy to see him. She was not always ready to admit how happy. One evening in May, Margaret came by and sat with Lydia on the steps of the store, which Lydia did sometimes in the evenings when the air was right, and Margaret said without preamble, "He is falling in love with you." "Margaret," Lydia said. "I am simply observing," Margaret said. "I have been watching people fall in love for 40 years and I know what it looks like." "You do not know that," Lydia said, though she felt the warmth of the words even as she argued against them. "He rides past your window every morning," Margaret said. "Has done for months. He fixed your shutter in a rainstorm. He comes to your store to buy things he does not need. He walked you home yesterday and stood at the door for 5 minutes talking about absolutely nothing of consequence." She paused. "Lydia, that is what it looks like." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "He might simply be friendly," she said without much conviction. "Lydia," Margaret said gently, "I have seen him in this town for 2 years. He is not a friendly man, he is a good man. There is a difference." She looked at her with affection. "And I think you know what it looks like from your side as well." Lydia said nothing. She looked at the street, where the evening light was turning everything copper and amber, and she thought about a man on a dark bay horse passing below her window every morning for the better part of a year, and she thought about the way his face looked when he listened to her talk about San Antonio, and she thought about her own chest when she heard the hoofbeats coming down from the south each morning, the particular opening of something that happened before she even saw him. "I know," she said quietly. Margaret patted her hand and did not make a production of it. It was on a Sunday walk in early June, the air thick and sweet with the smell of wild blooms that had come up along the creek bank after the spring rains, that she finally asked him. She had been building toward it for 2 weeks. She had thought about how to say it and had discarded a dozen approaches. In the end she asked it simply because simplicity was more honest and he deserved honesty. She said, "Why do you ride past my window every morning?" He went quiet. It was not the quiet of a man who had not heard her. It was the quiet of a man who had heard her very clearly and was sitting with what she had said, turning it over, and she understood immediately that this question had landed somewhere significant. They walked another several steps before he stopped, and she stopped too, and they stood on the creek bank with the water moving past them and the cottonwoods making their soft sound overhead. He looked at the water for a long moment. Then he said, "The road north is the most direct way from the tanner spread to the Anderson mill, where I go most mornings for lumber and supplies." He paused. "I have been making that ride for 2 years." Another pause. "The road goes past your building." She waited. She understood that was not the whole answer. He turned and looked at her. The directness of it, his eyes in the full morning light now, which she could see were gray with a slight green quality, like the color of the land after rain, was the same directness she had found in that first look from the window and had been falling into in increments ever since. "The first morning I heard you say good morning through that window," he said slowly, as though choosing each word with care, "I had not been expecting anyone to speak to me. I had been riding that road every morning for a year and a half and no one had ever said anything." He looked back at the water briefly, then back at her. "I thought about it all day, whether I had imagined it." A long pause. "I was at the mill and I could not concentrate on what I was supposed to be looking at." He stopped. "And," she said very quietly, "and I rode back past in the afternoon," he said, "to check whether the window was really there." He looked almost uncomfortable with the admission, a slight tightening around his eyes, a man not accustomed to revealing things about himself saying something he had been sitting on for a long time. It was. She felt the warmth of this moving through her, like something poured slowly into a cold cup. Clarence, she said, and the use of his given name was itself a small threshold, something she had not done before, and she saw him register it. You have been riding past that window for 40-some-odd days before I said anything. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I looked for you every morning. I did not know I was doing it at first. And then I did know I was doing it, and I did not stop. He met her eyes squarely. That is the whole answer to your question. There was nothing strategic or calculated in the way he said it. It was simply the truth, laid out in his straightforward way, without decoration, without hedging. She thought she had never been told something so plainly and felt it so fully. She said, I was at that window every morning waiting for you. He looked at her. I know that too, he said, and the steadiness of it, the quiet certainty of it, made her feel both seen and safe in the same breath. They stood at the creek bank for a long moment. Then he said, I would like to court you properly, Miss Hadley, if you are willing. She thought about 43 mornings of watching a man in a dark hat ride past her window and counting the days. Lydia, she said, I think you have earned the right to call me Lydia. The slow smile that moved across his face then was something she would remember for the rest of her life. He began courting her properly, which in Dustfield, Texas, in 1875 meant certain things and was noticed by everyone. He came to town twice a week in the evenings as well as his occasional daytime visits to the store. He would stop for her at 7 in the evening and they would walk the town together, sometimes stopping at the small cafe that Mrs. Perez ran on the corner, where the coffee was good and the churros were better, and they would sit across from each other and talk until the light was fully gone. Margaret approved loudly and without being asked. Dr. Hale approved more quietly and with more dignity. Will Tanner, apparently, teased Clarence about it, and Clarence had reportedly endured this with the patience of a man who understood that some prices are worth paying. He brought her things. Not extravagant things, nothing showy, but things that showed he paid attention. A book he had found at the trading post south of town, having learned she read whenever she could. A small bunch of the wild blue flowers that grew along the creek in the wet season, wrapped in brown paper from the store. Once, a horseshoe nail bent into the shape of a small ring, just a thing he had made without particular purpose one evening and put in his pocket, which he gave her with such a complete lack of ceremony that she understood it, was not a romantic gesture so much as simply an overflow of his thinking about her. And she found this more moving than any calculated romantic gesture could have been. She kept the bent nail on the shelf behind the store counter where she could see it. The summer of 1875 was warm and generous, and she was the happiest she had been since before her father died, possibly the happiest she had ever been. There were complications, of course, because life in West Texas in 1875 did not accommodate simple happiness for long without throwing something across the path. The first complication was Will Tanner. Will Tanner was 28 and running a cattle operation he was not quite equipped for, and by July he had made several decisions that were putting the ranch in a difficult position. He had taken on a loan from a man named Gerald Pratt, who ran a lending operation out of Abilene that was considerably more complicated than a simple business arrangement. Pratt's interest rates were punishing and his timelines were unreasonable, and by August, Tanner was behind on his payments, and Pratt had sent 2 men to Dustfield to communicate his dissatisfaction in various ways, including by interfering with some of the Tanner cattle, and making it known in the local saloon that the Tanner spread was not long for continued operation. This mattered to Lydia directly because it mattered to Clarence, who had put 2 years into that ranch and who felt a genuine responsibility to Will Tanner, who was young and foolish in some ways but not bad at heart. She could see the worry in him when it came, though he did not say much about it. He was the kind of man who carried his concerns quietly, and she had learned to read the signs, the slight distance in his eyes when he was thinking about something difficult, the way his hands were sometimes still on the table when usually he was moving, the occasional morning when he passed below her window at a pace slightly slower than his usual, a pace that had the quality of a man thinking hard. She asked him about it in late August, on one of their evening walks, because she believed that people who were becoming important to each other should be honest about the things that were weighing on them, and she said so, and he looked at her with that expression she was coming to know, the one that held a kind of grateful surprise at her directness. He told her about Pratt and the loan and the two men who had been making trouble. He told her that he had been spending his own savings on materials for the ranch that Tanner could not currently afford, because the alternative was watching the operation fail, and he was not built for standing by. He told her about a plan he and Tanner had worked out to bring a portion of the cattle to market early before the usual fall drive, to raise enough to satisfy Pratt's immediate demand and buy time to renegotiate the terms. It was a reasonable plan. It was also dependent on a great many things going right. She listened to all of this without interrupting, and when he was done she said, "What do you need?" He looked at her. "I am not asking you to fix it," he said carefully. "I know you are not," she said. "I am asking what you need, not financially. I do not mean that. I mean, what do you need?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through his habitual independence, the part of him that did not easily admit to needing anything from anyone. "I think I need someone to talk to," he said, finally, quietly. "About all of it." "Then talk," she said simply. He did. For a long time, as they walked the edge of town where the road dissolved into the scrub brush and the night sky overhead was enormous with stars, he talked. About the ranch and the worry and the money, yes, but also about what came after. About the fact that he had spent 13 years working other men's land and had not yet determined what he wanted his own life to look like. About the uncertainty of his position and what he could reasonably offer anyone from it. She stopped walking. "What do you mean, offer anyone?" she said. He stopped too. He looked at her in the starlight. "I mean," he said carefully, "that I am a ranch hand on a struggling operation with limited savings and no land of my own, and I am standing here with you, and I am aware of the disparity." She understood what he was saying, and she felt something hot and clear move through her. "Clarence Abbott," she said. "I run a dry goods store that I inherited from my dead father in a town I moved to knowing no one. I am 26 and I have no family left to speak of, and I was, before this year, the loneliest I have ever been in my life." She met his eyes. "Do not talk to me about what you can offer. Talk to me about what you want." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I want to stay," he said, simply. "Here with you," she said, "then stay." They stood there on the edge of the dark land with the stars overhead, and she thought that some conversations changed the shape of things irrevocably, and that this was one of them. September came with its turning temperatures and its shorter days, and with it came the complications at the Tanner ranch reaching their sharpest point. Pratt's men had been in town for 6 weeks, and their presence had become a pressure that the whole town felt. They were not violent men precisely, but they were the kind of men whose presence implied violence as a background note, and people were careful around them and avoided certain conversations in their hearing. It was on a Thursday morning in the second week of September that things came to a point. Lydia was behind the store counter when she heard raised voices in the street outside, which was unusual enough in Dustfield that she came to the door. Pratt's two men, whose names were apparently Cutter and Home, had stopped a wagon carrying supplies to the Tanner ranch, the driver being a young man named Bobby who worked part-time for various operations in the area, and were telling him in words not suitable for repeating that the goods he was carrying would not be reaching their destination. Lydia stepped out onto the boardwalk. She was not a woman who involved herself in other people's disputes as a habit. She was also not a woman who watched injustice happening from the doorway if she thought she could do something about it. She looked at the situation with quick clarity. Bobby was 17 and frightened. The two men were large and confident in their size. There was no law in Dustfield worth appealing to, the town marshal being an elderly man named Corrigan who handled minor disputes but was not equipped for anything more serious. She said, in a carrying voice, "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" They looked at her. One of them, Cutter, looked at her with the particular contempt that some men in that era applied to women who spoke in public spaces, and said that no, ma'am, there was no problem that concerned her. She said, "That wagon is carrying goods that were purchased at my store, the payment for which is registered in my ledger, which is a legal commercial document. If those goods do not reach their destination, that constitutes an interference with a lawful commercial transaction, and I will want to be speaking with someone about that." There was a brief silence. She was not certain this was entirely accurate from a legal standpoint, but she said it with complete conviction, and conviction is frequently sufficient. Bobby drove the wagon on. The two men watched it go and then looked at Lydia for a moment that was long enough to be mildly unpleasant, and then moved away. She went back inside and stood behind the counter, and let her hands be slightly unsteady for a moment where no one could see them. Clarence appeared at the store that evening, earlier than his usual time. He had heard about it from Bobby, who had apparently reported it in some detail to anyone who would listen, and his expression when he came through the door was complicated, a mixture of concern and something that was not quite anger but was the quieter thing that sometimes runs underneath anger. He said, "You did not need to do that." "I know," she said. "I did it anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. The complicated expression shifted into something simpler. "Thank you," he said. The Pratt situation resolved itself in the end, though not without difficulty. The early cattle drive happened in late September, Clarence managing most of the actual logistics while Tanner handled the selling, and the amount raised was sufficient to pay down the immediate debt and give the ranch breathing room. Pratt, apparently deciding that a fully operational ranch producing revenue was more valuable to him than a failed one, agreed to new terms that were considerably more reasonable. His men left Dustfield in the first week of October, and the town felt lighter for their absence. October arrived with the anniversary of Lydia's first morning of watching the rider pass, and she was aware of the full circle of the year in a way that made her quiet and reflective for several days, thinking about the woman who had stood at that cold window a year ago, lonely and uncertain, and thinking about herself now. The difference was Clarence. The difference was a man she had watched for 43 silent mornings before she worked up the nerve to say hello. She thought about how easily she might not have spoken. She thought about the particular stupidity of almost letting fear keep her silent, and she was grateful. In the deep and wordless way, she was grateful for things that mattered, that she had opened her mouth. On the second Sunday of October, the day bright and cold and the cottonwoods along the creek burning with yellow, he stopped on the creek bank at the same place they had stood when he had first answered her question about the window, and he took his hat off and held it in both hands, and he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "I have been thinking," he said, with the careful deliberation of a man who has been thinking very hard for some time, "about what comes after this year, about whether I stay at the ranch or whether I start looking at something of my own. Will has offered me a share of the operation in lieu of some of my wages, which would give me a small stake in the land eventually. I have also been looking at a parcel of land about 2 miles north of town, along the creek. It is not much right now. It would need work." He paused. He was looking at his hat. "What I want to ask," he said, "is whether you would consider marrying me." He looked up at her then. "I know this is not the most certain situation. I know I am asking you to take something on that does not have guarantees attached to it. I know the store is yours and your livelihood, and I am not asking you to give that up or change it. I am asking if you would be willing to build something with me, whatever that looks like, because the only thing I am certain about is that I want to build it with you." She thought she might cry, which surprised her because she was not in general a person who cried easily. She said, "Yes." He looked at her. "Yes." He said as though he wanted to make certain he had heard correctly. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. Clarence, I have been in love with you since February." Something moved across his face that she had no word for because it was entirely its own thing, particular to him, a kind of careful joy that took its time arriving, as though he was still checking whether it was safe to trust it. Then he put his hat back on and he crossed the 2 steps between them, and he put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her, gently and then less gently, there on the creek bank in the October light with the yellow leaves coming down around them. And she thought, with the clear and certain knowledge of a woman who knows her own mind, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in December, in the small white church in Dustfield, on a clear cold Saturday with a sky so blue it seemed to vibrate. Margaret Tellers stood as witness for Lydia and sat in the front pew looking pleased with herself in a way that she had earned. Dr. Emmett Hale sat beside her and was moved to a degree that surprised him. Will Tanner came, cleaned up and in his best coat, and Dex Purcell came too, and several of the people from town who had come to know them over the course of the year, and the church was full enough to feel celebratory. The minister, Reverend Greer, a tall, thin man with a kind face who had been doing weddings in West Texas for 20 years and had a genuine appreciation for the institution, said the words with warmth and conviction. Lydia wore a dress the color of deep cream with a collar of delicate white work that Margaret had found the fabric for, and that Lydia had spent 3 weeks finishing, and she had her dark hair pinned simply because elaborate arrangements were not available to her, and she did not need them. Clarence stood very straight and very still and looked at her as though she were the only thing in the room, which she supposed to him, in that moment, she probably was. When Reverend Greer said she could be kissed, he kissed her quietly and briefly and with complete attention, and then he pulled back and looked at her with those gray-green eyes and smiled, his full and real smile, the one she had learned to wait for, and she thought she had never seen anything better. After the wedding there was a supper at Margaret's boarding house, which Margaret had organized with what Lydia suspected was significantly more effort than she admitted to. And there was food and there was music, a fiddle player from south of town who was genuinely talented, and there was dancing on the wide board floor of Margaret's sitting room, which turned out to be a space well suited to it. Lydia danced twice with Clarence, who was a careful dancer, not flashy but solid and attentive, and once with Dr. Hale, who was a surprisingly good dancer for 60, and several times with various other guests while Clarence stood near the wall and watched her with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that Margaret, standing beside him at one point, said, "You should be careful. You are ruining your reputation as a serious man." "It was not that useful anyway," Clarence said, and Margaret laughed so hard she spilled her cider. They moved into the rooms above the store that same month, which were hers and therefore already established, and which Clarence adapted to with the quiet practicality that characterized everything about him. He added shelves where there had been none, useful ones in good positions, without making a production of it. He fixed the 2 steps on the stairs that had been loose for months. He learned where she kept things and remembered and did not reorganize them, which she appreciated more than she expected to. She kept the store. This had never been in question between them, and it was not a question from the outside either, in part because Dustfield was a practical town that needed its dry goods store and did not have the luxury of being judgmental about who ran it, and in part because anyone who wanted to have an opinion about it encountered Lydia's calm and complete indifference to that opinion, which tended to discourage the conversation. Clarence began working his own land north of town in January of 1876, alongside his continued work at the Tanner spread. The parcel he had been looking at was real, 2 miles north along the creek where it widened slightly, and the land flattened into a natural pasture. He had put some of the earnings from the fall drive toward it, and with the stake arrangement from Will Tanner building slowly, it was not impossible to see a path forward. He came home in the evening smelling of earth and work, and she would have supper ready, and they would eat together at the small table by the window and talk about their days, and she thought there was no better thing in her experience than this. The daily domestic reality of being known by someone, of sitting across from a person who understood the shape of your life because they were in it. She still woke early. She still went to the window at dawn. Now, instead of watching an anonymous rider pass below, she would sometimes turn to find Clarence already awake beside her, watching her with a quiet expression that asked nothing of her but let her know he was there. Sometimes he would get up and stand at the window with her while the early light came across the land, and they would stand there together without talking, which she found was one of her favorite things about being married to him. The comfortable silence, the no requirement to fill space. He still rode past the window in the mornings, on his way to the North Parcel or to the mill or wherever the day required. The routine of it was the same but different now, because she was not watching a stranger, and when he passed he looked up always and touched his hat brim, and she raised her hand in response, and this small exchange contained more understanding than most people managed in full conversations. Spring of 1876 brought good things. The North Parcel had been cleared and was beginning to take the shape of something with intention, a corral going up, the foundation of a proper small structure laid, plans for expansion that were realistic and measured. 3 horses that Clarence had acquired over the winter, 2 young ones with good bone and 1 older mare with a proven record, were the start of what he was building toward, which was a small horse operation of his own. He had a gift with horses that was genuine and rare. She had understood this in the abstract for a long time, but seeing it up close was different. She went out to the North Parcel on a Sunday in March and watched him work with one of the young horses, a nervous sorrel that had been badly started before Clarence got it, and the patience and understanding he brought to the animal was the same thing he brought to everything that needed care. The horse began to settle inside of 20 minutes in a way that she could see was about trust being built, carefully and without shortcuts. She sat on the fence rail and watched him work, and felt a large and steady feeling in her chest that she had come to understand was love in its ongoing, everyday form, not the dramatic arrival of it but the constant presence of it, warm and reliable as a well-made fire. In early April she told him she was expecting. She told him at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning, with the sun coming in sideways through the east window, the same window she had watched him from for all those months. She said it simply, watching his face, and his face did the thing she had seen it do at the creek bank when she said yes to his proposal, that careful arrival of something that was almost too much to trust all at once. He put down his fork and he looked at her across the table. "Are you well?" he said. "Is everything right?" This, she thought, was so entirely him. Not a performative reaction, but an immediate concern for her, practical and loving. "Everything is right," she said. "I am very well." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the small table and took her hand, which was something he did not do without intention, and he held it and said nothing for a moment, and the nothing he said was full of everything. Their son was born in late October of 1876, 2 years almost to the day from the first morning she had watched Clarence pass below her window. Dr. Hale attended, with Margaret present because Lydia had asked her to be, and also because nothing in Dustfield that was significant happened without Margaret near it. Clarence was in the next room, and the sounds of the birth were such that he wore out a considerable length of floorboard before it was done, a fact that Dr. Hale reported to him with professional cheerfulness and Margaret confirmed with personal delight. The boy was healthy and loud, and had his father's gray eyes and his mother's particular expression of watchful assessment, which was noted immediately by Margaret and reported to the town within the day. They named him Edwin Clarence Abbott, the first name for her father, which Clarence had suggested himself, and the middle name for its own reasons. The store continued. The North Parcel continued to develop. A second horse joined the original 3, and then a third. The word about Clarence's skill with horses spread in the way things spread in that part of Texas, slowly, and through the mouths of men who were careful about recommendations, because they could not afford bad ones, and he began to get work from ranches beyond the Tanner spread, and his reputation grew in the quiet, solid way that was consistent with how he did everything. He left the Tanner operation in the spring of 1877 on good terms, with Will Tanner's genuine respect and a handshake that meant something, and put himself fully to his own land and his own horses. The fear of this leap was real, and he did not pretend it was not, and she did not ask him to pretend. They sat with the ledger together one evening and went through the numbers carefully, as she had been taught to do, and the numbers said it was possible, and she said she thought it was possible, and he said he thought so too. It was possible. The years that followed were not without their difficulties. West Texas in the late 1870s was still a country with sharp edges, and the difficulties it offered were real. There were dry years that made the land hostile and threatened the modest progress they had built. There were disputes with neighbors about water rights that required careful navigation and a certain amount of patience with human stupidity. There were illnesses that frightened her, Edwin going through a difficult winter at age 2 that cost her several weeks of sleep and a considerable amount of prayer. But the shape of their life was good, and they knew it. They were not naive about the comparison. There was one winter, in 1878, when the weather was the worst in memory, and the roads were impassable for 3 weeks, and they were effectively confined to the rooms above the store with Edwin, who was a year old and in magnificent good health, and possessed of a tremendous curiosity about everything in his environment, and the small space required negotiation. Clarence, who valued his own quiet, found himself coexisting with a toddler who had strong opinions about silence and an equal disregard for reasonable sleeping hours, and he navigated this with so much more patience than she had expected that she fell in love with him a second time watching it. Something that happened to her periodically, these secondary fallings, which she understood as love not diminishing and rebuilding itself, but simply revealing new surfaces. She told him this once imprecisely, trying to explain what she meant, that she fell in love with him regularly in new ways. He looked at her with those eyes. "Good," he said simply. "I do the same," she laughed. In the spring of 1879, she became expecting again. She felt it earlier this time, recognized the signs, and told Clarence sooner, and he was quieter this time in his reception of the news, having presumably come to trust the good thing more readily than the first time. Edwin, who was 2.5 by then and spoke in complete sentences that frequently astonished both of them, was told he was going to have a brother or sister with a careful and age-appropriate explanation, and received this information with the solemnity of a person taking on significant responsibility. The baby, born in November of 1879, was a girl. She arrived with considerably less complication than her brother had, which Dr. Hale, now 64 and slightly more creaky but still entirely himself, said he appreciated at his age. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, because it was a name they both simply liked, and because Clara Margaret Abbott had a sound that pleased them and pleased Margaret Tellers so much that she did not mention it was technically her own name, simply smiled in a way that suggested she found the universe occasionally cooperative. Clara had her mother's dark eyes and a temperament that combined her parents in ways that took some time to understand. She was direct, like Clarence, but communicative, like Lydia, which meant she said exactly what she thought very clearly and at volume, and by the time she was a year old it was evident that the room she was in was the room she was running. Edwin adored her with the wholehearted devotion of a big brother who takes his position seriously. He regarded himself as responsible for her, and she regarded him as an excellent person to drag along on whatever she was planning, and this dynamic established itself early and remained consistent. The North Parcel had by 1880 become something that could genuinely be called a horse ranch. The structure that had been a foundation in early 1876 was now a full house, expanded twice, solid and livable and home. The corral had grown and was supplemented by 2 additional paddocks. The horses that Clarence kept and trained and sold had a reputation that extended well beyond Dustfield, and he had made enough from it in the past 2 years to pay off the land entirely and begin to think about expansion. The dry goods store continued to be Lydia's, and she ran it as she had always run it, carefully and with complete competence. She had hired a young woman named Rosa Perez, daughter of the cafe owner, to help 3 days a week, and this had given her more flexibility without reducing her own involvement in the operation she had built over 6 years from the uncertain inheritance. It had been to the steady commercial anchor of Dustfield's Main Street that it had become. She was 32 in 1880, and she felt the fullness of her life in a way that made her sometimes pause in the middle of an ordinary moment. A morning at the window, an evening at the supper table, a Sunday afternoon at the North Parcel watching Clarence work, and Edwin following him with focused mimicry, and Clara sitting in the dirt with magnificent unconcern for her clothing, and she would simply take note of it. The fullness, the completeness. She had not expected this. She had expected to manage and to get on and to be sufficient unto herself, which were the things she had prepared herself for. She had not expected the man on the dark horse. She had not expected to be brave enough to speak first. She had not expected that the quiet man on the dark horse would turn out to be the very specific shape of the thing that fit alongside her in a life. In June of 1880, on a warm evening when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that children sleeping produces, Lydia and Clarence sat on the porch of the North Parcel house, which faced west and therefore received the full benefit of the evening sky. The light was doing its best work, the horizon a deep range of colors from pale gold to dark rose to violet, and the land around them was settled and theirs. He said without any particular lead-up, in the way he sometimes said things that had been waiting in him for a while, "I think about that first morning sometimes, when you said good morning through the window." She looked at him in the evening light. "What do you think about it?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, watching the sky. "I think about all the mornings before it," he said. "All the mornings I rode past and did not look up." She had not known that. She had always assumed he was unaware of her in those early weeks. "You did not look up," she said. "I knew the window was there," he said. "I started knowing it was there after the first month." He paused. "I just did not know what to do with that." She thought about this. "So you kept riding past," she said. "I kept riding past," he said. She looked at the colors happening in the western sky, the violet deepening, the first stars arriving. "What would you have done," she said, "if I had never said anything?" A long pause. "I would have kept riding past," he said, and then quietly, "and I think that would have been the central regret of my life." She reached over and took his hand, the way he had taken hers at the breakfast table the morning she told him about Edwin, with intention and without flourish. They sat in the evening quiet and held hands and watched the sky finish its business for the day. In the years that followed, the town of Dustfield grew. New families came. A schoolhouse was built in 1881, which Lydia had been among the most vocal advocates for, and which Edwin, at 5, attended with the enthusiasm of a child who had been talked to like an adult since he could speak, and was therefore well prepared for structured learning, and also slightly difficult for the teacher. A young woman named Helen Marsh, who handled him with admirable composure. Clara would follow 2 years later. Clarence's horse operation expanded to include training work for ranches as far as 100 miles out, which meant occasional trips away from home that they managed, and that she handled during without dramatic difficulty, because she was exactly the same person she had been before they married, capable and steady, and because he was back when he said he would be back. Reliable as the morning, which she had known from the beginning was something she could count on in him. Margaret Tellers turned 60 in 1882, and the town threw her a party at her own boarding house, which she claimed to find unnecessary and obviously loved. Dr. Hale, 67 now and beginning to slow but not yet slowed enough to admit it, came and ate too much and told stories, and proposed a toast that went on long enough to become genuinely moving. There were losses, too, because life insists on them. Pete Garrity, who had unwittingly given her Clarence's name on that December evening 6 years before, died of a heart failure in 1881, and she felt it more than she expected to, because he was part of the story in ways she had never told him. She went to the service, and she sat beside Clarence, and she thought about a small act of information given across a store counter that had been a thread in the weaving of the life she was now living. Will Tanner sold the ranch in 1882 and moved east to marry a woman from Dallas and try his hand at commerce, which by all accounts suited him considerably better than cattle ranching, and Clarence attended his send-off and came home quieter than usual, with the particular quality of quiet that marked the closing of a significant chapter. "Are you all right?" she asked him. "I am," he said. "It is just strange. When I came to that ranch I had nowhere particular in mind to be. And now I have all of this." He looked around the kitchen, which contained evidence of their family in every direction: a child's drawing fixed to the wall, Edwin's small boots by the door, Clara's hairbrush on the shelf, the supper cooling on the stove. He looked at her. "I cannot imagine what I thought I was looking for," he said, "when I was looking." She thought about 43 mornings, about a window, about a woman who almost stayed silent. "I think you were looking for a window to ride past," she said. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and he smiled slowly, his full and real smile. "I think you are right," he said. They were 38 and 37 that year, which was not old but was old enough to know what they had, and to know what it was worth, and to hold it accordingly. In the summer of 1883, Edwin Abbott, at age 7, announced with complete conviction that he intended to be a horse trainer like his father. This was received with warm amusement, and also, on Clarence's part, with a kind of thoughtful seriousness, because a child who says something like that with real conviction deserves a thoughtful response. He began taking Edwin with him to the paddock on Saturday mornings, explaining what he was doing with slow and patient clarity, answering every question Edwin had, and Edwin had a great many questions, and watching his son learn to move around horses with the beginning of the same ease that he himself had, which was something that appeared to be transmitting. Clara, at age 4 in 1883, had a different set of interests that were still sorting themselves out, but appeared to include mathematics, animals, and being in charge of things. She had recently organized her toys into a system that Lydia suspected was more sophisticated than it looked, and had also rearranged the kitchen shelves in a way that was actually an improvement, which she was not going to tell Clara, because the child did not need additional confidence. That Christmas was the fullest one Lydia could remember. The house at the North Parcel was warm and well lit, and they had invited Margaret and Dr. Hale for the day, and Rosa Perez and her family came for the evening, and the children were of an age where Christmas was a spectacular event and made it so for everyone nearby. Edwin, who had learned to read with remarkable speed and application, read the Christmas reading aloud at the supper table with the careful pride of a child who knows he is doing something significant, and Clara sat beside him and listened with her head slightly tilted and her expression of concentrated attention. After supper, when the guests had gone and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Lydia sat in the chair by the fireplace and Clarence sat in the one beside it, and the fire was low and the room was warm. This was one of their rituals, the end of the day, the still point. "Good Christmas," he said. "Very good Christmas," she said. He reached over and took her hand as he did, as he had done since that morning at the breakfast table, the spring Edwin was coming, the gesture always carrying the same weight of intention it had the first time. She held his hand and looked at the fire and thought about the particular abundance of her life, which was not abundance of money or abundance of ease, because West Texas in the 1880s did not offer those things reliably, but abundance of the kind that actually counted. The children in the next room, the man beside her, the store on the main street of a town that had become, in the years she had spent there, genuinely hers. The land north of town that they had built from a raw parcel into a place that had the character of everything they had put into it. She thought about the window. She thought about a morning in October of 1874 when she had stood at a cold window and watched a stranger pass and begun to count the mornings. She thought about the 44th morning when she had asked a question that went to the center of a thing, and about the silence before his answer, which had been its own kind of answer. She thought about a man who had kept riding past a window because there was something there he recognized without knowing how to reach, who had kept doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was to show up, reliable and present day after day, on the chance that something might eventually be possible. She thought that love, in her experience, was frequently like that. Not the arrival of it, which was the part everyone wanted to talk about, but the persistence of it before the arrival, the daily choosing of proximity to something you wanted without knowing if it would ever be yours, the willingness to keep riding past. "What are you thinking about?" Clarence said. She looked at him in the firelight. "The window," she said. "The mornings, all of it." He looked at her steadily. "I think about it too," he said. "What do you think when you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment, the fire settling between them. "I think," he said, "that I almost rode past 100 more times and never looked up, and that would have been a very different life." "Yes," she said. "I think you saved us both some considerable time by speaking first," he said. She smiled. "You could have spoken too," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I did not." "No," she said. "You were braver," he said. She thought about the woman who had stood at that window with her coffee, half awake, heart hammering, saying hello to a man who had not yet looked at her. She thought she would not have described herself as brave in that moment. She would have described herself as tired of being quiet. "I was just tired of watching," she said. He squeezed her hand. "Thank goodness for that," he said. The fire burned down and the night was full and quiet around the house at the north parcel. And in the next room, Edwin and Clara were sleeping as only children sleep, completely and without reservation. And outside, the January stars were enormous over the flat dark land, and Cedar's successor in the paddock, a dark bay gelding who had also turned out to be a very good horse, stood quiet in the cold, and the north parcel was still and full of everything that had been built there. Carefully and together, over years of ordinary, extraordinary mornings. Lydia Hadley Abbott sat beside her husband in the firelight, and she thought that the most important thing she had ever done in her life was open a window. She thought that the most important thing she had ever said was something as simple as good morning. She thought that love, when it was the real kind, the kind that held and built and stayed, did not announce itself with ceremony. It arrived in increments. It arrived in the same road taken every day, in the slow return of a gaze, in a shutter fixed in a rainstorm, in a bent nail left on a shelf, in 43 mornings of watching and 1 morning of speaking and all the mornings that came after, each one chosen, each one new, each one adding itself to the one before it until what you had was not a single moment but an entire life, full and complete and entirely worth the quiet courage it had taken to begin it. Outside, the wind moved across the dark land, and the house at the north parcel stood solid against it, and inside the fire was low and warm, and Clarence Abbott held his wife's hand in the stillness of a good life they had built together from nothing more and nothing less than the ordinary miracle of 2 people finding each other in a wide and uncertain country and deciding, one careful morning at a time, to stay.